Right, good evening everybody. Fellow councillors, ladies and gentlemen, before we move to the business of the meeting, I have an announcement to make. At our last meeting, we paid tribute to Councillors Jackson and Winter, who are standing down in May. This evening is also Councillor John Keith's final meeting of council, having represented Derby in 3 periods since 1976. Councillor Holmes, would you like to say a few words? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly would. As you just said, John was elected to Derby Borough Council in 1976 as one of the 3 Conservative councillors for Normanton Ward. I was just 5 years old then, and some of us in this chamber weren't even born. But there are a few that were elected back then and are still here serving the city all these years later that will have worked with John over the decades. John served a 3-year term, not in prison, sorry, at the council. Sitting on the Housing and Transport Committees until all-out elections and redrawing of ward boundaries in 1979. I like the sound of that. We'll see what we can do. I think it was then when the ward map of Derby that we are all now more familiar with was formed. And he was re-elected in 1982 for Blaygreaves Ward. In 1983, he was elected to the powerful Policy and Resources Committee, and I've been told that's the rough equivalent of the Cabinet. And he also served on the Disciplinary Subcommittee. And I think that served him in good stead because I've been told that when announcing to a full chamber that there were to be a brand new facility at Queen Street, he muddled his words to tell everybody that there would be a new spanking facility. Well, I'm pretty sure that the councillors would probably know a little bit more about that than others, but I know but I know that John would agree with me when I say this time very carefully that he welcomes the brand spanking new swimming pool at Moorways, and he'll be more than welcome to join the councillors of this city in 2021 at its opening. That Queen Street was to play a very significant role in John's political life, as when he was mayor of the city in 1991 to 92, he accompanied Her Majesty the Queen to reopen it as the Queen's Leisure Centre alongside his late wife, Mayoress Susan. He was one of a succession of 4 Conservative mayors who had a casting vote over, would you believe, a council of 22 Labour members and 22 Conservative members. What fun and games that would have been. I'm sure. I don't know if any of you were there. You would have been. Yeah. How things have changed, and so has Derby. So John served from 1986 to 1995, and during that time he sat on more committees, including Leisure Services, Planning, Development Control, Economic Development and Tourism, Housing and General Purposes. Whatever general purposes are, I'm sure Robin will fill me in later on that particular committee. But a storm was coming, and the Conservative group was actually reduced to 3 members, Councillor Webb, Councillor Black and Councillor de Sotoy, in the 1995 election. Seemingly a weather bell for what was to come in 1997 in the general election. But John's political career wasn't over. Like Rocky Balboa in Rocky IV, he was persuaded to return to the ring in 2011 and was elected as our first Conservative councillor for Micklehove in a number of years. And that's when myself and Alison got to know John, and now we count him and his wife Andrea as one of our friends, not just a colleague. Both can be proud of the work they do for the community and Micklehove. Certainly he should be proud of the hard work that he's done over the years in many wards. All I can say about John, and there's many things you can say about John, and they're all he's just a fantastic bloke. And I haven't met anybody that's got a bad word to say about you. You're fantastic, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with you, John. I honestly say that from the bottom of my heart. You're considerate, you are tolerant, nothing's too much trouble. You will always go the extra mile for residents that you represent, and that's what you've done over the years. I know you very well, and I know that you're respected by everyone who knows you. He's quietly gone about his business as a councillor in a way that is an example to others. I couldn't have asked for anyone better as a ward colleague, and as a deputy leader and former leader of the group, he's been an inspiration for everybody as to how to carry out your business as a councillor and look after this city and residents. So I'd like to just sum up, and before I make you cry, John, because I know you're a bit, you are very humble, but you do deserve all the praise that I'm trying to give you, and I'm probably not putting it across the way I should, but I hope you understand. I really do mean what I'm saying here. You are going to be greatly missed. Myself and Alison wish you all the best, and as do the Conservative group and the wider Conservative Party, because I know that you've done a lot outside of this chamber too for the party. I want you to have an absolutely fantastic retirement and relax and have fun. I know Andrew is going to be well pleased. He's going to be getting you to do all sorts of things, but I hope you enjoy every minute in your new life outside of politics. And you should be rightly proud of your record, John. Thank you.
I didn't expect that. But we're not disappointed, John.
Thank you, Councillor Holmes. Can you turn your microphone off, please?
Sorry.
That's right. Are there any other contributions? Anybody wish to say anything? No? Well, thank you for your contributions over the years, John. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Councillor Skelton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, John is one of my and Joe's constituents, so we would like to wish you a very happy retirement, John. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Skelton. We'll move on to the main business of the meeting. Do we have any apologies? Councillor Stanton.
Councillor Winter, Councillor Bayliss, Councillor Dinser. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that seems to be everybody. Right. Declarations of interest. Does anybody wish to declare an interest? No. Right, we'll move on to the main business of the meeting, which is the A52 Transport Improvement Scheme from the Central Midlands Audit Partnership investigation. We have before us a report of the Chief Executive detailing the outcome of the internal audit investigations in relation to the A52 Transport Improvement Scheme. This follows a resolution of Council on the 12th of July 2018 that the results of this partnership investigation are brought before Council for debate. The draft motion before you is contained at recommendation 2.1 of the report. I appreciate councillors may want clarification on some aspects of the report, so I'd like to invite the Chief Executive to address Council and to respond to any questions you may have prior to the commencement of a debate to be held under the normal rules. Carol.
Thank you, Mayor. I received the final audit report on the 18th of January 2019. I then took advice from a range of colleagues in readiness for its publication and spoke to the external auditor a number of times. Those referenced in the report were advised of the imminent publication and a range of briefings were undertaken. So the report published on the 7th of February differs slightly from the version issued to me. Very minor changes were made to make the report easier to understand. For example, the addition of a more detailed glossary and a map to clarify some key points and to make minor redactions for reasons of either commercial confidentiality and in the light of further HR action that's being taken. So, for example, removal of names and use of gender-neutral pronouns. And further details are in the covering report. Scheme costs were originally expected to be 14.906 million, and at the point of releasing the audit report, costs were estimated at 33 million, for which approvals were secured from Cabinet last September. Further work was done, and the unconfirmed estimated cost at the time of publication was around 42 million, and we're currently finalising costs as we speak, and these will be brought to Cabinet as soon as possible. The report identifies a series of weaknesses. This was a poorly conceived and costed project. There were weak governance, risk management, financial management and project management arrangements. Contract management within the council was inadequate. Issues were not appropriately escalated to more senior officers and councillors, and there was insufficient oversight and challenge by line management, and there is evidence of inadequate officer leadership. There were problems with the scheme from the start due to not having sufficiently mature designs in place when letting the contract and an over-optimistically low budget for the works. This was compounded by placing unreasonable reliance solely on one individual officer for defining and checking detailed designs and specifications. There was also insufficient challenge to initial and subsequent costings and inappropriate descoping of works. Issues were not escalated, and there was insufficient management oversight and grip. The audit findings evidence that many problems and issues are centred in the officer domain. Councillors are not expected to be experts in project and programme management. They have a legitimate expectation that they will be well supported and served by officers and provided with sufficient briefings and information for them to exercise their roles. The report evidences that, until more recently, this has not been at the consistent standard it should have been. There is no evidence of fraudulent and/or criminal activity. Now, action has already been taken to address the weaknesses and more is underway, and I'd just like to summarise that now. Firstly, in terms of project management, in June 2018, project management arrangements on this scheme were strengthened. A strategic board was set up to oversee the project and it is met regularly. The board's composition and administration now reflects standard project practice, with the fundamentals of effective project management now being in place. I joined the council in August 2018, and that autumn I established a corporate programme management office and a project managers network to support portfolio programme and project management across the council, and significant work has been undertaken to improve project management arrangements and corporate grip. Secondly, in terms of governance, there will be a further report to the Council's Audit and Accounts Committee setting out the systems weaknesses outlined in the audit report, and an action plan will be produced and implemented. I've also commissioned a further audit review of all of the key and/or significant projects and programmes within the Communities and Place Directorate. And whilst current arrangements on this project are much stronger, I've commissioned a review to make sure they reflect absolute best practice. The previous senior responsible officer has been removed from the project and replaced. And then finally, in terms of HR issues, there are 4 colleagues who, as a result of the findings of the report, are subject to separate employment-related investigations. These are well underway and must run their course. There would have been a similar process applied to some former colleagues had they still been in the council's employment. I'm happy to respond to any councillors' questions that you may have. Thank you, Mayor.
Does anybody have any questions for the Chief Executive before we move to the debate proper? No? Okay. Councillor Poulter, will you address the council?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As leader of the council, unfortunately it falls to me to introduce this recommendation at 2.1 in the papers. The first thing I want to say is that this is the last report I would like to see coming before this council, and on behalf of the council, I'm embarrassed that we are in the position to have to discuss this situation tonight. The second thing I need to do is to thank those responsible for the report. The Central Midlands Audit Partnership have done a fantastic job on this. It is detailed, it's consistent, it was uninfluenced. They were left to do their duty in respect to this and have produced an excellent report. That's been acknowledged by many people, including the external auditors of this council, in the quality and standard and composition of this report. There were, Mr. Mayor, some within this chamber and elsewhere that didn't consider them capable of doing this. Our stance in relation to the appropriate persons to do this inquiry has been vindicated, because this is a perfectly adequate, more than adequate report into these unfortunate circumstances. So thanks to them, and thank you to Don McClure, who oversaw this and was consistent in his assurances that this was the appropriate way in which to deal with this inquiry. So those need to be on record, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, make no mistake, this has been a monumental failure of this council. a failure that we inherited as an administration, and that, as you will recall, the day after we took control of this council and found out about some of the extent of these problems, we were open and honest and transparent about. We held a press conference and we let the council, the media and the public know of some of the extent of the problems that we were later to establish. That has been our policy from the beginning on this. It's continued to be our policy, and it will be until it's totally resolved. The third thing I need to say is to point out that there is no doubt that this was an important, necessary and essential scheme for the city. When it's fully delivered, it will reduce congestion across the A52. It will give more and easier access onto the estate, and it will open and release significant land for development which Derby seriously needs. In effect, it was the right thing to procure this piece of work. That said, I have asked myself and thought to myself on many occasions since, was it right for the council to do it in the first place? If you're not sure, you don't have the resources, and in particularly the necessary funding in place, this project should never have been entered into in the first place. We as an administration will deliver this full scheme for the benefit of the city within the final cost envelope and the timescales, which will be detailed to Council and Cabinet at the earliest opportunity. Councillor Holmes, my colleague, will detail how we will deliver this. We will deliver it with the minimum of further disruption for the public. We will deliver it to the best possible standard with no compromise. We will do it at the minimum possible cost, and we will do it within the final timescales that we will announce. We will not make the same mistake of entering into a project that we haven't got a cost for, and we haven't got proper timescales for and proper designs for. That's not the way we will work. Mr. Mayor, there's been significant costs as a result of the failings in this project. I'm sure I don't need to enhance or shout too much about the serious financial consequences, and the public have been, and quite rightly, are shocked at the extent of the cost of these failings. Further to that, though, Mr. Mayor, the reputation of this City Council has been seriously damaged and will take some recovery, but we are working on that. The extent of the disruption and the inconvenience and the frustration that we've submitted the people of Derby to is shocking. It's embarrassing. There are, however, lessons to be learned, and your Chief Executive, Carol Mills, has explained some of the things that we together are doing to rectify the situation to ensure that this does not happen again. There will be a full review of existing projects. There will be reform of project management and processes. There will be proper risk and financial management in any project that this council runs in future. And there will be appropriate governance and resources dictated to necessary schemes. We will continue to be open and transparent, and we will look forward to delivering this programme in the future. We will continue to rectify the cultural problems within this council that contributed to the failings that we've sustained. We will support and work with the current senior management team to ensure that the failings are fully addressed, and through the appropriate disciplinary proceedings that Mrs. Mills has referred to, we will come to some conclusion. We will be certain that every necessary measures are taken to avoid a repeat of such events in the future in our city. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Poulter. Do you have a seconder?
I'd second, Mr. Mayor. I reserve my right to speak.
Very good, thank you. I think Councillor Willoughby was first to have his hand up, and then Councillor Eldred.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Obviously, as has been alluded to earlier by the Chief Executive, the report, in particular the findings of this report, come under the jurisdiction of the Audit and Accounts Committee, that I chair, obviously. And all of the considerable areas of concern identified by the report are obviously within the scope of the committee. And I have to say, I'm glad to say that, you know, at our meetings, as we've been through this stuff through the year, we've already seen an improvement in these areas through the regular monitoring at the committee since I obviously became chair just under a year ago, and obviously when the thing broke at the same time. But however, this report clearly demonstrates, though, that more is to be done to ensure systemic improvement to the Council's processes in the areas obviously discussed in this report. And I'd like to obviously pay tribute to some of the good work that's already been started by the Council, particularly by officers such as Heather Greenan, who's sitting behind there, and Don McClure, who've obviously started on the journey of improvements to the Council's risk and project management processes, and something that Councillor Poulter, you know, has obviously referred to already. And just as for the, you know, the S24, Section 24 recommendations that sort of came out sort of probably mid-2017, the Audit and Accounts Committee will be responsible for monitoring the resolution of the recommendations detailed in this report, and I expect us to receive regular progress on these at our meetings during the next municipal year, as we have already for the S24 recommendations. So this will start with a review of the Systems Weaknesses report that the Chief Executive referred to earlier at our meeting in June, which is our next available slot with the elections and PERDA and stuff like that, once the actual report is being prepared, because it's currently being produced by the audit team after issue of this main report. And obviously the corrective actions to the recommendations is being agreed prior to the issue of the Systems Weakness report. It's going around the various officers. So as this final Systems Weakness report's not yet available, our committee, we received a briefing yesterday ahead of today's meeting to gain an understanding into those key areas of systems weaknesses. And like the main report, these very much focus on failures in the Council's internal workings and action officers can take to ensure this doesn't happen again. And I think those who were there yesterday will think that we had a very useful session, and you know, it was during like a sort of workshop meeting where committee members actually made a few suggestions for some sort of maybe additional recommendations that the auditor was going to consider when he puts in place the final version of the Systems Weakness report. So I'm standing here, having said this, as you know, as the current chair of Audit and Accounts, to assure the full Council that the resolution of these recommendations and those of the further audit reviews that the Chief Executive mentioned in her speech, and also the various improvements in the area of procurement and contract management that the leader spoke about in his speech, that they'll be very much at the forefront of the committee's activities during the next municipal year. And actually we have the second of our risk workshops this year happening in a few weeks' time, when we'll actually be looking at the whole Council's procurement and sort of contract and procurement process in a more detailed way, because it's obviously one of the major risks on the risk register now. So it's very much, we're going to be hands-on on audit and accounts, making sure, holding officers and others to account, that the recommendations, the final recommendations, particularly in this Systems Weakness report, which is what the Audit Committee consider, are very much addressed, so, and continue to be addressed. We continue on the good work that we've done already. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Wilby. Councillor Eldred.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd also like to start by thanking the internal audit team for the thorough investigation that they conducted and the detailed report that they presented to us, which not only sets out incredibly well what happened, but does it in a way that lay people like ourselves can understand and learn from. So I appreciate that. So I think we do need to give particular thanks to Richard Bonham as the head of internal audit and his team for conducting this investigation over what was a lengthy period of time, and presenting us with important but I think difficult findings, as the Leader of the Council has alluded to. Obviously, this was a project that had problems from the start. Clearly, as the Chief Executive said in her introduction, there were issues with officers not briefing members adequately, not presenting the information to members in the way that they should have done, not escalating issues even to senior officers or elected members. It was clear that actually what I think was particularly surprising and shocking to me was the fact that it was clear that there were issues with the costs of the project as early as August 2017, and yet no members were briefed until May 2018 in terms of the escalation of those costs. I think that was a particularly difficult thing for me to read, and I think it's absolutely right, the process that the Chief Executive has now put in place of reviewing all ongoing projects and future projects to make sure that this doesn't happen again is really, really important. I think that, you know, there's obviously lots of things in the report. We don't necessarily want to go into the detail of it, but I think there are many, many lessons to be learned, and I'm confident that the team is in place will learn those lessons and put those lessons into practice. I do think what stood out for me a couple of times within the report was a reference to a workforce who are particularly stretched, a workforce who were maybe focusing on multiple projects when they should have only been focusing on one, a lack of resources, the inability to completely focus on these projects. And I have to say, you know, that is the reality of an authority as Derby's, which has had its resources stripped away over a long period of time. We see this time and time again. That, you know, since 2010, resources have been stripped away from this council to the extent that officers are stretched, they are overworked, and people are working, you know, above and beyond. And many, many officers in this council are working above and beyond every single day. And what I wouldn't want this report to suggest is that all of the officers in the council are not doing the job they should be. The vast majority of the team that we have here at the council do an amazing job on a day-to-day basis, and I see how they personally go above and beyond as the years have gone by and their jobs have expanded and the number of colleagues they have around them has decreased, how they have given their all and gone above and beyond in terms of their work, and I think that should be acknowledged. But we do have to acknowledge that local government is at breaking point, and without a solution to this, we are putting at risk not just projects like this, but services that we see on a day-to-day basis, and we cannot ignore that. So I think let's focus on what happens now you know, coming together, because I think, you know, the Leader of the Council's talked about the administration and what they plan to do, and I think that's really, really good. But actually we have a responsibility in this as all 51 councillors, as councillors who sit on scrutiny boards and see reports that go to Cabinet, as councillors that sit on Audits and Accounts Committee, and as councillors who, you know, go about our day-to-day business and read the reports that come across our desks. So what I'm interested in doing is actually thinking about how we can work together across parties to resolve some of these issues, to make sure that something like this never happens again. We, as the Labour Party, are committed to doing this, and I think that should be the focus now, that we should focus on the next steps, we should focus on working together. That's what the people in Derby want. People of Derby want to see that these issues are being resolved, and they want to see that their politicians are stepping up and not dealing in petty politics or finger pointing or point scoring, but actually they're working to resolve these issues, and that's what we're interested in, that's what the people of Derby deserve, and that's what we want to see coming out of this debate tonight. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Skelton now.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too would like to pay tribute to Central Midlands Audit Partnership. They have done a very thorough job. Their report obviously does not make for pleasant reading. This project went disastrously wrong, and the seeds of its own destruction were there right from the beginning. The auditors found weaknesses in governance, risk management, financial management, project management arrangements, contract management. Issues and problems were not properly escalated and therefore weren't dealt with. And management obviously didn't give any appropriate oversight and challenge. Could be said that councillors perhaps didn't do any of that either. Auditors' reports obviously cover things where there is a trail of evidence, and that's usually in writing. Phone calls, unless they're systematically logged, wouldn't feature. So I do wonder whether we have the absolute full picture here. We will probably never know. The report does contain some statements that raise further questions. For example, the principal contract representative stated there was political pressure to get the scheme started. That's on page 22 if you'd like to look, even though the scheme was not actually ready to start on site. And the question needs to be asked, how much did this contribute to the disaster? I'm sure it was a factor. Schemes should not, of this sort of magnitude, should never be started just because some politician says they want it started yesterday. Additionally, no mention is made of the negative culture that was prevalent in the council's former leadership. And this, of course, was highlighted in the LGA's peer review of the City Council and in the follow-up letter. The letter stated, a small number of individual councillors who were in key positions and who had been behaving in ways which appeared to be well adrift from the standards expected and were away from the members' code of conduct and the member officer protocol. These behaviours were having a poor impact on overall officer perceptions of councillors and on trust between councillors and officers. And that, colleagues, is the background to this project. The report also comments that briefing was done at a broad level due to the relationship we had with members at the time. That is quite an indictment of the poor working relationship between officers and cabinet members on this project. There also appears to be differing recollections of when cabinet members were told or when they knew the project was in some difficulties. Some members may have known as early as August or September 2017, but by January, February 2018, the expected costs were greater and were more quantified, and more money was required, and extra money was then approved by Cabinet. So something must have been told to councillors at that point for it to go to Cabinet. These facts then have to be compared to the statement that Cabinet member Afzal made to Radio Derby. He said, and I quote, "I've not done anything wrong."
Excuse me, Chair. The councillor is attempting to name councillors in the report and smear councillors in the report who are not actually
It's
named
public record.
in the report.
This has been on Radio Derby.
Quiet, please.
It is completely inappropriate to continue to present false information from this report and not present a real picture. And I absolutely object to Councillor Skelton continuing to do this as she has done in public. The report is very clear. It is in black and white. I can come back on the specific points that she's raised where there are obviously she is misleading the chamber in terms of the context of the report, if you would like me to,
No,
Chair.
I'm not misleading, I read it carefully.
Mr Mayor, can I just make
I
a point
quoted
that the
something
clock
from
wasn't
Radio
paused
Derby.
for about 20 seconds after the interruption?
Well, this is a quote from what was on Radio Derby. Oh, yeah. But this is the truth. He said it on Radio Derby.
Thank you, Councillor Skelton, and all councillors. You are not to. You are reminded that you cannot name people in association with the report because the report has been redacted in the first place. You're entitled to use the phrase like cabinet member, but you are not allowed to name any individual. You and Councillor Eldred, you'll have a chance to respond to the specific points later. Thank you.
Right, a cabinet member made a statement to Radio Derby. He said, "I've not done anything wrong. I've not been made aware of it. The first I was made aware of it, and I'm making this on council record, was after the elections. As soon as I was made aware of it, I contacted the chief executive." On page 41, the former director confirms that members had the option to join the project board, but withdrew and had just short briefings. It beggars belief that a cabinet member couldn't recognise that a multi-million-pound project was something that they should be taking a keen interest in. Had they been on the project board, there would have been a sporting chance of that person recognising that things were going pear-shaped. This leads on to consider the weaknesses in the cabinet system of governance. With just one cabinet member making decisions, the system is reliant on that one person having the knowledge and skills required, as well as common sense and an inquiring mind. Compare that to a committee of, say, 8 people who together have a range of skills and experience that would not be found in one person alone. Officers are better held to account.
That's your time up, Councillor Skelton. Thank you.
Can I say that the clock continued for some time? Right. Okay.
It was stopped for 20 seconds.
Right.
Councillor Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am going to refer to some councillors, but in a generic sense, where they've replied to situations in this council chamber, so I hope you'll bear that in mind. On this report, Mr. Mayor, officers responsible are being investigated, and it is clear that the structure was weak. It's also clear that some officers did a runner to other councillors, and those left are being dealt with. In political terms, this council should be ashamed of itself, in particular the Labour Party, whose culture brought this about. The Labour group has a habit of overspending and hang the consequences. What is worse about this case is that whether it was the lack of understanding, the leader at the time, the cabinet member responsible, and the cabinet as a collective. What is incredible in these papers is how some of the cabinet took their extra allowance but did not put in the work. A lackadaisical approach to responsibility, a lackadaisical approach to spending money, and a lackadaisical approach to political ownership. If I refer to the 2017 peer review, Mr. Mayor, there's a paragraph in there that says, however, responsibility did not lie solely at the door of those councillors. There was also a failure of political groups to properly hold those individuals to account, and to use group and party processes to act against poor behaviour. Although the word groups plural has been used here, the vast majority of concern was expressed about a small number of members from one particular group. This past year, Mr. Mayor, I've witnessed the old-style bandweight politics rampant throughout the Labour group, where we thought it was just him. Councillor Eldred, when she became leader of their group, I recall talked about talking to all leaders of this council for the sake of the city. Despite my party numbers making a huge difference this year, she never, not once, tried to contact me. Such is her strong dislike towards me and my party. Even when I pointed out that questionable activity was taking place in my ward by their Labour councillor, she couldn't even reply to me. Despite my concern that public money was being used for electioneering purposes, it is a very rare trait, a very Labour trait. They just do not care. Then there is Councillor Shanker, who tries to convince Sinn Féin residents that the Labour group has nothing to do with the incinerator when everyone knows they were all for it. And then we had former Councillor Banwaite and Councillor Rawson putting on a brave face.
Can we order, please? Order.
Mr. Mayor, this is about the contexture, the culture of the council at the time.
They're trying to shut down speech.
Clearly, they don't like the fact that they were in charge at the time of this fiasco. Then we had former Councillor Banwaite and Councillor Rawson putting on a brave face on many issues that angered people in the city, such as the teaching assistants, moorways and assembly rooms.
I am advised that you're straying off the point somewhat, Councillor Graves.
I'd like to mention Councillor Afzal, who said he didn't know anything. He said that in this chamber. He said that in this chamber that he didn't know anything.
Is somebody raising a point of order?
Maybe you can let
Who?
the chamber know.
Just, excuse me, Councillor Graves.
Yeah, I've finished on that, Mr. Mayor. You okay? Thank you. It is clear from this report that the fiasco was
Just
known about.
hold on a second. Somebody just raised a point of order,
Okay, thank
please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The point of order is that the Chamber's already been advised by the monitoring officer that we shouldn't be referring to councillors by names because that's been redacted in the report. So can I ask Councillor Graves to apologise for that, please?
Mr. Mayor, I'm talking about Councillor Afzal talking about things in this chamber, not in this report.
That's fair enough. But, okay, carry on.
Thank you. It is clear from this report that the fiasco was known about before the last local elections and makes me wonder if pressure had been put on officers not to reveal the situation until after the elections. This year, Mr. Mayor, that vein has continued. Scrutiny meetings have become a vehicle to voice their frustrations at not being in charge, trying to put officers under scrutiny rather than policies. Cooperation by local councillors for the sake of the city is not part of the psyche of the Labour group in Derby. For some reason, they see it as a weakness. Even when one of their own members ups and leaves them, they still cannot see that they're...
Councillor Graves, you're still wondering... We're supposed to be discussing the audit report, not the state of politics in the Labour group. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, this is another disgraceful episode in the life of the Labour group.
I take it you've completed. Thank you. Councillor Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's been thanks already given for the quality of the report, and I echo that as well. But one thing that the report talks about quite often is members, that members were kept informed, that the members were told about something. And that phrase, members were told, was a sort of corporate us. The 51 of us were told, but in practice, in many cases, it would have been only one person, the cabinet member, or it would have been the cabinet that were being told about something in a cabinet briefing. And I think that's quite an interesting perception that officers have, that their duty is to keep us informed, as members are being kept informed. And I think this is something that the internal audit people were picking up from the officers involved in this particular instance, but is also part of the psyche of the council. And we are not telepathic towards each other. I don't know what the other, it's not 50 people, but the other 40-something people in this chamber are thinking. As I hope nobody else does, because I don't believe any of us are telepathic. And I think that is something that we need to actually think about in terms of how we make our decisions and how we do best for people. Because if one person, as Councillor Skelton mentioned, one person doesn't have the breadth of knowledge and experience and strengths and weaknesses, skills and other attributes that will enable them to be able to make the best decisions on behalf of people in Derby. And how we come together and do that is something that we need to explore further. The delegations that went through some of the committee, some of the steps that this project took through Cabinet meant that there weren't many opportunities for scrutiny to actually look at what was going on unless it was taken up as a project by one of the specialist scrutiny boards. But our scrutiny function has been so shrunk that it's very difficult to be doing a project on anything. And certainly as a vice chair of a scrutiny, not at this time, but well, currently, but not earlier, it's actually very difficult to get someone to write you a report which isn't already going to Cabinet. And a report that's already going to Cabinet is going to be looked at the day before by scrutiny anyway. And scrutiny was trying to do its job. So in July 2015, scrutiny said, need to make sure that costs are carefully monitored. And in December 2016, scrutiny records that members queried the risks associated with the scheme and were reassured that these had been considered and would be managed appropriately. But this is very light touch scrutiny, and we clearly needed to have more, and it wasn't there. So we need to do something about the level of scrutiny and the capacity of scrutiny, because officers are relying on member oversight. The number of times members are reported in this internal audit report to actually have giving some justification and weight to the decisions that are being taken. So although our Chief Executive has said we need to be able to rely on the officer expertise, and we should be, but we also need to keep that independence and that active thinking to ensure that there is that cooperation and there is that balance, and the checks and balances are in place as well. I also think we need to look beyond what we are doing here, and it's not just at how we organise ourselves as members. There was also pressure put on us by D2N2 in terms of the timing for the spending of that money, and also the size of the budget that we were working to. That there is an expectation in government that there should be a contingency of 44% for highways schemes. They are notoriously difficult to price up because you don't know the ground conditions as well as you might. And this was brownfield land as well. And we have met difficult situations. But D2N2, officers were concerned that D2N2 would not like us to be doing that. And the contingency that this allowed was a mere 5%. But if D2N2 had expected a 44% contingency, we might again not be quite where we are now. There might have been more scrutiny done about what is actually happening. So although we have no authority over RLEP, I think it's something that we ought to be writing to them about from what has been found by our investigation. There are other things to learn, such as the points about overworked officers that Councillor Eldred reported, and those need to be looked at
It's
too.
your time up, Councillor Kerr, thank you. I don't have any other speakers, so Councillor Ashburner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a fair, thorough and impartial report. What can be learned from it? The reporting tool needs modification. Any questionable project modification, for example, descoping, should result in a risk increase and report colour modification, with specific risk finished where, for example, descoping corrects the situation. The Risk Management Handbook from 1918 needs to be reviewed in the light of this experience, with more emphasis on what constitutes a risk rather than the size of the risk matrix. From experience, my main risk analysis on the railways was mostly to do with death, which is something outside the scope of this council. Councils need to take, including cabinet members, need to take a real interest in projects, especially their high priority pledges. It is not coincidental that problems were discovered when a new group of councillors took charge. A fresh pair of eyes see new things and ask more questions. It's not party politics. I'm not saying that Labour are necessarily less competent, just that after so long in power, they grew complacent. There needs to be a shared location for all project documentation, ideally in a computer which is backed up and checkable. Ideally, grant-providing bodies should be less fixed in their spending calendar. I don't believe we have a chance of that happening. Emails need to be retained for several years rather than the 6 weeks reported in the report, giving more emphasis to evidence creation and retention. On significant jobs, it might be worthwhile having a copy of contractor risk register. I disagree with the comment in this report that if the contractor risk register is reduced, the client risk should go up. Some risks affect both in a similar way, supplier failure for one. Audible recordings of important meetings, I believe, should be made and retained and referred to by project. I believe this mess records was exacerbated by a cabinet system rather than they would be reduced by a committee system where all councillors would be able to work in teams on particular areas of interest. Senior staff should at least know what their staff are doing and monitor it. Officer D seems to have decoupled from everyone else in their team. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Always make a point of speaking when Eric does. I just wanted to touch on the role of scrutiny because it has come up and Lucy's touched on it. And I think throughout this project, I was the chair of the Executive Scrutiny Board and not named in the report. But I'd like to name myself because I sat on and chaired a cross-party committee of members throughout this chamber, and reports came on this subject, and also performance updates against those key pledges. And you know, I quite like to think there were some quite keen eyes in the room, people looking out for, you know, to trip up the administration or to, you know, playing our role in overview and scrutiny. And we didn't see it, we didn't spot it, we didn't highlight it, and it certainly wasn't highlighted to us. There were problems going on, and people knew about it, and either those senior officers in the room knew about it and didn't want to tell us or wanted to skirt over it, or they didn't know. Now, I'm reassured by some of the things I've heard today from Councillor Poulter and from Carol and some of the changes that have been put in place. I guess what's kind of shocking is that those changes needed to be made. Any sort of organisation of this size running projects of that scale need to already have those things in place. And if all we learn from this is some of the political point scoring that we've heard tonight, there will be very expensive points. As a council, not one administration or another, we're embarking on Moorways, the Guildhall. We've got to finish off the A52. We've got numerous other large projects, and if we cannot deliver large projects, and instead we let the failure of that fall on to just blame the latest members in charge and move on, then all we'll see is a conveyor belt of councillors coming and going, and the failures of the council just compounding year on year. We have to get better. We have to deliver better value for money for our taxpayers. Now, one of the key findings of the peer review was the toxicity between councillors, and we've seen some of that tonight, and I'm going to put my hands up you know, I played my role in that over the years as well. But there needs to be ways in which that we can reach across the chamber on things like governance and these large-scale projects and go, come on, let's take a sensible stance on this and ensure that we're safeguarding the legacy of this council and what it does for its residents. And I think there's loads of positives from this report, and I think this should just be a massive lesson for us to take forward and look for additional training, and just to ensure that if we don't know, that we ask. We're not experts in the fields of, you know, procurement of contracts or project management, or some of you might be, but I certainly wouldn't want this project in sole responsibility, and I wouldn't expect to as an elected member. But we need to learn from this, otherwise we'll just carry on getting it wrong. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Stanton. If there are no other speakers, Councillor Holmes, you sum up?
I'm not going to sum up, Mr. Mayor. I think that's the leader's job, but well, I think it's clear the steps this administration took when inheriting this project. They've been well documented and reported, so I don't really want to return to those, but I think it's far more important to focus on the more recent actions and how we plan to deliver the scheme to completion. The reasons for the project, its positive outcomes are easily and understandably lost in the light of the very significant operational and budgetary issues that it's faced. And we've heard tonight many negative things, and quite rightly so, because lessons need to be learned. But I want to give not only members, but the business community and the public confidence that we will deliver a fully scoped and, in regards to some elements, an enhanced scheme that will bring huge benefits to this city. We're building a much better and stronger links with Galliford Try. This involves signing off, for example, of a one-team approach with their managing director and joint and robust reporting. A new project board structure is now in place to keep the focus on and to drive forward towards delivery and ensure that we've got a firm grip of the project. Now, I've been involved as the lead cabinet member from day one of us inheriting the project, and it's been a high priority for me, obviously, along with the leader. Unravelling the issues to reset them and resolve them has been a huge challenge, but the determination to get through this and get it back on track has never faltered, and I have to thank officers for their support that they've given us politically to get that job done. But there's still a lot of work to do. But it is true to say that it's taken up a very significant amount of our time collectively as a cabinet and administration. You know, we've had to deal with that as we drive forward the other priorities and pledges that we made to this city alongside all of that. And I think it's testament to the strength of this cabinet and leadership that we have delivered so much so far. We know there's more to do, but we've had to do that whilst dealing with this major issue and this major project that needed to be brought back on track. So our approach was to support officers, and we see the leaders described the initial actions that we took were quite right. And whilst those were in train, our job was to support officers and ensure they understood that politically we were committed to doing whatever it took, wherever it takes, to get the project back on track, and to deliver it too. So, just to bring us right up to speed, where are we now? Well, as I said, we have a proactive joint approach to the ongoing work to finalise designs and drawing details. For example, the final design and drawings details for the last piece of work for Wyvern and Stanier Way is due to be submitted this week, which is a major milestone. We're aiming to get a report to Cabinet, as the leader has said, as soon as possible for final estimated price budget approval. And it's important to state, as the leader has, that we are absolutely committed to delivering to that budget, cost or less. We're also going to be further strengthening the project team soon as we move towards the delivery of major components of the overall scheme. And that goes back to our political steer to officers to say, if you need resources, if you need support, we're here to authorise that for you. This project must be delivered. And we've given that assurance. And, you know, it's the culture as well. Many things have been talked about governance and culture, and it is absolutely essential. I'm not going to get dragged into a political tit for tat and everything. At the end of the day, my focus is delivering this scheme for the city. But I do have to say that we have worked very hard on the culture and the governance of this council so that officers can approach us, and knowing that we'll listen. And even when it's very bad news, we will listen and we will work with them to resolve it together. And I think that's what we need in this council, is a proactive approach where everybody works together. Nobody's afraid to speak out if they've got an issue. And I hope that this administration has proven that that is exactly what we're doing here. And I will work as hard as I can, and I know my colleagues will. And I hope that all councillors in this chamber will support us to deliver this project for the city, because it will have huge benefits. And I very much look forward to putting forward the major elements of this project in due course. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Holmes. Councillor Poulter, would you like to sum up?
I would, Mr Mayor, thank you. And firstly, I just apologise because I had hoped to be able to move to the vote on this, because I'd hoped that other members of this council would follow my lead in apologising for their role in this mess to the public of Derby. If not apologising, then at least expressing some personal regret as to how this came about. Unfortunately, that's not happened. So I do need to come back on a number of points. particularly in relation to Councillor Eldred's contribution tonight, because whilst I wasn't surprised that she didn't want to go into the details in this report, I was surprised that despite acknowledging the good work of the Central Audit Partnership, she wasn't prepared to apologise for doubting their capabilities in producing this report, and that certainly should have happened. At the end of the day, earlier on completing her contribution, she went on to say somewhat hypocritically that she voiced the intention to work together as members of this council to do what's best for Derby. And yet she went on to acknowledge that she hasn't even spoken to Councillor Graves and wouldn't do because of his politics. That's no way forward for this council. We need to work together to be able to do this. Now, in terms of the rest of it, for her to display the hypocrisy in talking about the ability of this council being damaged by stripping back, what was the expression? Stripping back and removing resources from the senior management team. Well, Mr. Mayor, I'm afraid there's no greater hypocrisy there than I've heard, because ultimately I well remember the previous leader of this council standing up there and gloating, absolutely gloating, that he was responsible for cutting the senior management team to its bone, to, if not the smallest, certainly one of the smallest management teams in the country. And that made a major contribution to this, these mistakes made by this council. Unfortunately, he did that with the intention of being able to say he was saving money. Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Mayor, that backfired on him royally. Not just on him, but most importantly, on the residents of the city, with the cost that has had to our city. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Poulter. We will now move to the vote. Thank you. All those in favour of the recommendation, please show. Are there any against? Are there any abstentions? No, that is carried then. Thank you. Well, thank you all for such a well-behaved evening. You made my life a pleasure. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, can I just say before you rise, this is effectively your last full council meeting in charge. On behalf of the administration, I think you've done us a royal job in the way you've conducted these meetings. Always in a fair manner, always in a calm manner, and you've got through the business in sometimes tricky situations. On behalf of the administration, thank you for your efforts. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.